Hello everyone, welcome back to this video series on clinical SAS SDTM programming. In this video, we will see an example for creation of SDTM QS dataset, which is questionnaires dataset. So for this questionnaires dataset, we will be using a specific questionnaire called EQ5D, which has 3 levels of responses. So let's first quickly try to understand what does EQ5D 3-level questionnaire contain. So EQ5D-3L stands for European Quality of Life 5-dimension 3-level scale questionnaire. So it is used to assess the quality of life of a subject in 5 dimensions, mainly mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain or discomfort, and anxiety or depression. So we will see how to transform this information which is collected in this questionnaire into SDTM QS dataset in this lesson. Now let us move on to the case report form that is used to collect the information for this questionnaire. So we have a form called EQ5D-3L, so in which the questions are date of collection on which the subject has responded to this questionnaire, so and the score on how the subject felt for mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain or discomfort, anxiety and depression, and visual analog health state visual analog score. So now let's see the SDTM annotations that will be used to uh, map this particular form information to. So basically this information gets mapped to QS. So let us see the annotation for each of the fields. So if we see the first variable that is corresponding to the date of collection, which the raw variable name is QSDAT underscore raw, has to be mapped to the standard datetime variable QSDTC. And then we have this question called mobility, in which the raw variable is named as EQ5D3L underscore 1. So let's see where does this information from this field get mapped to. So here it says this information has to be mapped into QS variable when QS test CD is equal to EQ5D0101. Similarly, let's continue with other fields. So let's see where does this information get mapped to. So which is corresponding to self-care. So here this information again gets mapped to QS variable, but when QS test CD is equal to EQ5D0102 question. Now let's quickly move on to the other question. So here the next question is getting mapped to a test CD called 0103, and then 0104, and then 0105, and then finally 0106. So we have 6 questions basically. So and these 6 fields are getting mapped to 6 different test CDs, and the numbers are given here. So now let us come back to the specification for this. So before that, let's take a look at the input data set for this. So the information from that particular CRF form is getting translated into a data set that looks like this. So we have one column for each of the questions that were being asked, and one column for the date of collection, and then we have some additional columns which are common for all the subjects. So here we have study ID, subject, folder seek, and folder name, and record position. So these fields are collected, and then these are the specific questions which are coming from a particular from EQ5D3L form. So now let us come back and then see the specification for this and then jump to the program. So here we have the specification for QS domain for EQ5D3L questionnaire. So here for study ID, we are being asked to populate it as myCSG, and for domain, so we are being asked to populate as QS. For USubj ID, so we are being asked to concatenate the values from study ID and subject with a hyphen in between. And for QS seek, we are being asked to sort the records based on USubj ID, QS cat, test CD, QSDTC, and set to 1 on the first record of each subject, and then increment by 1 for each subsequent record within the subject. And then for QS test CD, so we have some description given. Let's go through that. So the response to each question item is collected in a separate variable. So we have seen that questions in CRF form, and we have also seen the raw dataset that is coming out of that form. So we have seen that we have a separate variable for each of the question. So we need to transform the data such that we create a row for each question. So SDTM QS is a findings domain which has the structure of one record per subject per test CD per time point. So but here each question is present as a variable, but we need to transform that information as rows. So we have the specification mentioning that. So it says create a record with QS test CD is equal to EQ5D-0101 to store the result from EQ5D-3L1. So this is for first question. And then we are being asked to create a separate record for this to capture the information from this question. Similarly, we are being asked to create a separate record for EQ5D-0102 for the question EQ5D-3L2. So similarly, we have the specification for all 6 questions asked. And then for QS test, so we are being given the exact text value or test value that has to be used for each of the tests. So for 10101, it is said mobility, so self-care, usual activities, pain or discomfort, anxiety or depression, and VA score for all the subsequent questions respectively. And then for QS CAT, we are being asked to populate as EQ5D-3L. And then for original result, so we are creating records for each of the questions. So populate using EQ5D-3L1 when creating row for EQ5D-0101 test CD. And then similarly for other cases. But we have one note here. Let's take a look at that. So note for questions 1 to 5, use only the second component from the result variables when hyphen is the delimiter. So let's see what exactly is the value present in each of these 5 questions and what does the second component mean. So here if we see 1 hyphen I have no problems, 3 hyphen I am confined to bed. So for all the 5 questions, so the result is present in 2 different components. One, the first, the numeric component, and then the description associated with that. So we are being asked to use only the second component for QS or RES, and they have mentioned that hyphen separates the first component and second component. So that we'll have to handle that when creating our QS or RES to make sure that we are only using the second component. And then for QS STRESC, looks like the derivation is the same as QS or RES, but here this time we will have to use only the first component. So the first component is that numeric component. So if say for example for this particular question on this subject, so on this particular date, so we'll have to populate QS ORRES with the value of I have no problems in walking about, and QS STRESC will have to populate the value 1 because this is the first component. So again for QS STRESN, so we are being asked to populate using QS STRESC by converting it into numeric wherever applicable. For this specific questionnaire, we do not have any information that corresponds to unit, so we are being asked to set it to null in QS STRESU. And then for QS LOB-XFL, which is last observation before exposure flag, so we are being asked to populate as Y on the latest record with non-missing result on or prior to DMRFX STDTC for each subject and test. So this is a last observation before exposure flag. So we'll have to check, compare our collection dates with DMRFX STDTC and then populate it on the last record on or prior to DMRFX STDTC. And then for QS evaluator, we are being asked to populate as study subject. And for visit number, we are being asked to use the values from folder seek variable in the raw data. And then for visit value, we are being asked to use the value from folder name variable. And for QSDTC, so we are being asked to populate it based on the values from QSDAT underscore raw after converting to ISO 8601 format. And then we have the derivation for QSDY. So we are being asked to populate as the difference of these two dates and add 1 if it is on or after reference start date. Otherwise, we don't need to add that plus 1. We just can populate it based on the difference of QSSTDTC and RFSTDTC. And we have this final variable which is called evaluation interval text. So populate as today. So now we will move on to the programming of this. So let's open SAS program in full window, and then meanwhile we'll have the datasets open in a second tab. So here again, so similar to the previous videos, I have the code that creates my input datasets in a program named this way. So I am including that program here in this program using %include. So all the code present in that code executed with this %include statement, and I'll have all input data sets required for this lesson available for subsequent processing in the code. So what I'm doing here is, in the first step, is to create a copy of the input dataset and calling it as QS01, and creating a copy of demographics dataset, which is SDTM DM, and calling it as DM01. And then we are jumping to the required variables creation in QS domain. So you are using that QS01 dataset, we are creating a dataset called QS02 and creating common variables which are required for all 5 test CDs. So study ID and usage ID. So for study ID, we were asked to use the text of my CSG, so we are assigning that. And for domain, so we are being asked to we were asked to use the text QS, as this is a questionnaire dataset, so we are assigning that. And for usage ID, we were asked to concatenate the values from study ID and subject with a hyphen in between, so that can be achieved using catx function. So for that, we need to specify the delimiter as the first argument, and then specify the rest of the variables on the from the second arguments to the catx function. And then for QS DTC, so we are in this, again we are going with the assumption that there are no partial dates expected in this form. So we are first converting the collected date values to numeric values using input function and date11 format in format, and then further converting it into ISO 8601 notation using YYMMDD10 dot format of put function. So we know that when we only have the date component available, uh, so YYMMDD10 dot format is equivalent to the ISO 8601 notation of date values. And then we are assigning other variables which we were directly asked to assign based on the specification. For QSCAT, we were asked to populate it as EQ5D-3L, so we are doing that. And we were asked to assign the text today for QSEVINTX, and then study subject for QSEVAL variable. So we are doing that assignments here. And for visit num, we were directly asked to use the value from folder seek, so we are doing that here. And for visit, we were asked to use the values from folder name, so we are creating that variable here. So here comes our core logic, so wherein we are creating rows for each of the tests. So we have these individual questions are being present as variables if we have seen the input data, but we need to transform this into final data set to have one record for each of the question. So we will have to have a separate row for each question. So, but in the source we have each of the question as a column. So we need to handle that transformation. So we will make use of explicit output statements in data step to create this logic. But here we will not duplicate the logic for each of the sections using output statements, so like we have seen in some other videos, but we will make use of arrays. So we'll go through this code in detail. So here we are defining an array named qvars, saying that I have these 6 variables are being defined with the short name of qvars. So how does this get translated to? If I want to refer the first variable from this, I will have to say it as qvars of 1. And for second variable, I will just have to say qvars of 2. What do I mean by when I say qvars of 2? It checks the name of the variable which is listed in the second position in this array. So even if the suffix was not underscore 2, so it goes by the position. When I say qvars of 2, it goes and checks the second variable in the list of variables which I have passed here. And then I am creating a variable and another array called test cd, and this is a temporary array. So and then here I am assigning the values for this temporary array. So here I want to use the value EQ5D0101 for the first question, which was named as EQ5D3L1, and for second question, that SCD that was supposed to be used as per the specification was EQ5D0202. So I am creating this temporary array to hold the test CD values that have to be used for each of these questions. So this has to have one-to-one relationship in the same order. For first question, this is first test CD. For second question, it is second test CD. For third question, the third test CD. And so we should make sure that there is no difference or mismatch between the test CD that has to be used for each of the questions. So this is a temporary array. So what happens if we do not use the temporary keyword is that we get these 6 variables. This test CD array creates 6 variables. By default, what happens in an array is that if you have a variable that gets referenced, but if you do not have a variable, that variable gets created. So here, if I have not specified the temporary keyword, 6 new variables would have been created with the value with the names as testcd1, testcd2, 3, 4, and so on. And the value in testcd1 would have been EQ5D-0101, testcd2 EQ5D-0102, and so on till EQ5D-0106. But I do not want a permanent variables to be created because of this array. So I am making use of this temporary. One other thing to note is that I am defining the length of 8 for these 6 temporary array variables. So if I had not specified this 8, so it would have uh, assumed some length. So, but I want to explicitly mention that it has 8. So I am using this $8. And then we have now defined the test CDs in this temporary array and named it as test CD. And we have defined the variables which have the source information in this array called QVARs. Now let us come to the core logic. So here what we are doing here is we are looping the array with an iterator value of temporary variable I from 1 to dim of qvars. So what does dim function do is it checks the number of variables listed on this array named qvars. So here we have listed 6 variables. So this dim of qvars gets translated to the value of 6. So we are repeating these all these lines of code 6 times. So once for each of the variables. So we'll see that how this gets processed. But so effectively what we are doing here is, so all these lines of code is iterated 6 times because we have specified them within this do and end group. So why is this becoming 6? Because we have specified 6 variables here. If we only had listed 3 variables here, dim of qvars would have become 3. So all these lines of code would be executed thrice. So now let's come to the individual lines of this code within this do loop. So what is happening on this line of code is we are creating a variable called QS test CD, and then we are saying test CD of I. So as we discussed, so this lines of code get executed based on the number of times it gets evaluated to. So each time with the value of I being incremented by 1. So it begins with 1. So when I say test CD of I, so the value in the first iteration would be 1. So test CD of 1. So what is the test CD of 1? So when here it goes and checks the variable value that is specified in the first position. So test CD of 1 is EQ5D-0101. So it fetches this value EQ5D-0101 and assigns to the value of QS test CD. And then let's move on to the next question, next line of code. It says scan of qvars of I -1, which means the last word, and we are specifying that the hyphen is the delimiter. So let's now see how this qvars of I gets evaluated to when it is processing with the value of 1 in I. So qvars of 1. So we have listed 6 variables here and we have named the array as qvars. So the value in I is 1. So qvars of 1 is it goes and fetches the variable which is listed first here. So what is the variable here? So it is EQ5D-3L1. So this entire qvars of 1 now is replaced with the variable name of EQ5D-3L1. So from EQ5D-3L1 we are extracting the last word when hyphen is the delimiter and assigning it to the value of QS or RES. And for stresc, so again we are using qvars of I as we are in the first iteration of the loop. Qvars of I, it refers to EQ5D-3L1 and then fetches the first word and when hyphen is the delimiter and assigns it to QSSTRESC. So there are two components. When I say -1, it becomes the second one or the last one from the ending. So and we are, as per the specification, we were supposed to use the last component or the second component from the individual 5 questions. So and assign it to QS or RES, but for QS STRESC we were asked to use the first component. So we are handling that using scan function and explicitly specifying the delimiter and the word positions. And then for QS STRESN we are converting the value from QS STRESN to QS STRESC to numeric using input function. And then for QS ORRESU we were asked to use the null text, so we are assigning that here. And then for QS STRESU we are using the value null value from QS ORRESU. And then we are writing the record using output statement. So what have we done here? So when I is equal to 1 is processed, the information from EQ5D-3L variable is used and the first test value from test CD array is used to create a row for that test CD from, and the result values are created from the first variable. And now when it is processing for the second time with I value is equal to 2, what happens is it uses the variable EQ5D3L2 and it uses the test CD value of EQ5D0102. And similarly, each time when the loop is incremented for all the way till 6, so it would use EQ5D3L3 when I is equal to 3 and use the value of EQ5D0103 for test CD. So 4 and 4, 5 and 5 and 6 and 6 and all. And each time within the loop we are creating using an output statement, which means for one observation now this gets translated to 6 observations because this is getting incremented or run 6 times based on dim of QVARs. So let us take a quick look at our QS02 dataset and see how that is looking like. So here if we see in QS01 we only had one record per subject at a particular date value. But in QS02 now we have 6 questions, so and 6 observations and 6 questions. So how many times do we expect the loop to run? So 6 times for each subject. So 6 multiplied by 6 is 36. So we are expecting 36 records in QS02. Let's see how if that is the case. So here we have 36 records. So let's see for one subject what is happening. So here if we see for 7th Jan subject 1001 what is happening. So we had 6 individual questions. So and now we were creating 6 individual test CDs. So let's see if examine the QS test CD values. So for the first time when I is equal to 1 this record is created. I is equal to 2 we use the value from second question and second test CD, and then third question, fourth, fifth and sixth, and then it incremented for next subject. So now we achieved the desired result of transforming questions into uh, variables into rows using the concept of arrays here. So let's move on to the next step. So we now have achieved the desired transformation. We'll create additional variables on this. So we are now trying to create LOBXFL, which is the last record prior to exposure flag. So for that, what we need is the RFXSTDTC from demographics to be compared with QSDTC. So let's now we are fetching RFXSTDTC and RFSTDTC into our QS dataset by merging at subject ID, study ID and subject ID level and keeping only those rows who have those records of those subjects who has a record in QS02, and then the resulting dataset is named as QS03. So in order to populate baseline flag, the requirement was to consider only those records which are on or prior to RFXSTDTC with non-missing result. So we are trying to subset those records. So where QSDTC is less than or is equal to RFXSTDTC and QS ORRES is not missing. So we may get one or more than one record per each subject and each test CD with this filter. So from this, so what we need to do is pick the latest available record. How can we achieve that? So we need to sort the records based on study ID, USUBJ ID, QS test CD and QSDTC. So within each QS test CD, the records with earliest date comes on the top and latest date comes at the end. So if we pick the last record for each test CD, so that record corresponds to our chosen baseline record or the LOB XFL record. So from this, so what we are doing here is we are indicating that the records are already grouped or sorted, and then picking the last record for each test CD within a subject, and then keeping only those variables. So now we will make use of this information present in base 02. So technically what we have done here is, so we have identified the QSDTC of each test CD of a subject, which is becoming the LOBXFL record. So we will use that dataset information and then merge it back to the parent dataset. On the matching record of that QSDCD and QSDTC of a subject, we are populating QSLOBXFL as Y. So if we see, we are saying that if B, then QSLOBXFL is equal to Y. So we are expecting only one record per subject per QSDCD in this record. On that chosen record in the parent dataset, we are populating QSLOBXFL as Y. So let us see the intermediate datasets that are getting created in this step. So basically in base 01, so we have filtered the rows which correspond to non-missing result and the collection date prior to RFXSTDTC. And then in base 02, what we have done is chosen the record which for each test CD that has to be the baseline record. Say for example, here for subject 1001 for QS test CD of EQ5D-3L, the record from 21st Jan 2023 should have become baseline. So we have identified the record that is becoming baseline in this dataset. So we have used this dataset and all the variables from this dataset to merge back to our parent dataset, and then on the record on that subject, that test CD and that DTC, we are flagging LOBXFL as Y. So let's come back to the code. So we are saying if B. So if B will become true only for those study ID, USUBJ ID, QS test CD and QS DTC that is coming from this base 02. On that record, so LOBXFL is being assigned as Y. Now let's come back to the datasets and then open QS04 and then see, we have seen that for subject 1001 for 0101 test CD, the 21st Jan record should have become baseline. So QS test CD is equal to EQ5D-0101. So 21st Jan record is becoming, where is QSDTC? Yeah, 21st Jan record is becoming baseline. So this record is of 7th Jan, this record is of 21st Jan. So based on our processing on base 02, we have seen that for 0101 test CD for subject 1001, the record of 21st Jan should have LOBXFL populated as Y. So that is being achieved here. So let's now move on to the further coding. So here we are trying to create the QS test values. So we were given in the specification what are the test values that have to be used for each of the tests. So we are achieving that using if then else statements. And then we are creating numeric version of QSDTC and storing it in a variable called QSDT. So, and then creating a numeric version of RFSTDTC and storing it in RFSTDT variable to make use of them in creation of study day variable. So we are checking if both of them have a value and then creating QSDY as QSDT minus RFSTDT plus QSDT greater than or is equal to RFSTDT. So this would get evaluated to 1 when this is true, otherwise this gets evaluated to 0. So this is short form notation of creation of study day variable. So otherwise we could have checked if QSDT greater than or is equal to RFSTDT and then split it into two different sections or two different lines of code. And then we are creating seek variable. So we were asked to sort the records. I think in the specification QSCat was also mentioned. So but as this data set of EQ5D-3L, we only have one questionnaire. So even if we skip QSCat here, it would not make a difference. But so we can update it to include QSCat as well before QS test CD if we have more than one questionnaire. So we are sorting the records based on the logic specified in the specification, and then we are assigning the value of 1 to QSSeek on the first record of each subject. On all the other records we are incrementing it by 1. So we have completed the derivation of all the major variables, and then in the final dataset we are keeping only the required variables. So this is how we can program any findings domain wherein we need to transform the variables of individual questions as rows in SDTM findings domain. Thank you for watching and keep learning.